So today we're going to begin a study in Dr. Cornelius Van Til's book, Why I Believe. I have a copy of the book there for you. I don't know if you can still see me on the screen, but here's my copy of the pamphlet here, Why I Believe in God. Rick has a newer version of this, but you can see it's not a thick booklet here. It's
21 pages.
21, okay. So not much to it, but I think it's a very profound book, and I hope that it'll be a blessing to you. I wanted to share some. I'm going to put this one down, and I'm going to share another screen for you that has some pictures of Van Til and give you a little bit of his background here. This is a picture of Van Til probably towards the end of his teaching career. You can see the years in which he lived from 1895 to 1987. He was throughout his tenure a professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. From 1929 to 1972. He did spend a year as a professor of apologetics at Princeton Seminary, the year 1928 through 29. There's some more pictures of him here, and maybe I can give you a little bit more of a view of him. That's him there. He was known for going to Wall Street and into the city to preach, do some street preaching. I have a picture of him and another evangelist by the name of Jack Miller on the streets of Wall Street in New York. It was Manhattan, I guess, doing street preaching there. He's a pretty remarkable guy. This is a nice picture of him here, and kind of interesting glasses there, octagonal, or not quite octagonal, but an interesting look. I wish I had glasses like that.
Hexagonal.
What is it?
Hexagonal, 6 sides.
Okay. And a very natty tie, looking sharp there. Nice haircut. That's another picture of him, I guess, from one of his lectures. Yeah. Looks like he's sitting on the desk there. There are many stories of him being a lecturer at Westminster Seminary, including the fact that first that he would have a lot of scribbling on the chalkboard with chalk. He'd go through a lot of chalk, and one of his famous illustrations is of 2 circles. And I think I've shared this quite some time ago in our group back in the days when we were meeting at Chick-fil-A, but he would have 2 circles, one a big circle and then a smaller circle, separated from each other, and he called that the creator-creature distinction. The big circle represented God, the small circle represented the creation. And he made the point that God is separate from his creation. He's not a part of it. He's not, his being is not contingent, or is not, I should say, continuous with the creation. His being is distinct. He's God, and we are not. We are finite. He's infinite. He is without beginning, without end. We have a beginning, and so forth. So, and then he would draw 2 lines between these 2 circles and say there's a creator distinction, but also a creator-creature relation, and God does interact with his world. And so those who were his students would say that he would have these 2 big circles, and then he would write all kinds of names of philosophers and theories and that sort of thing. The board would be filled with things like that. And if you happened to fall asleep in his class, he did not tolerate that.
Yeah.
He would throw a piece of chalk at you. So
I've heard of a few guys who got chalk thrown at them.
Yeah. So.
And the chalk was falling apart, so they got dusted. by at least that's what Ed Eppinger told me.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he apparently was a a rather animated teacher, very enthusiastic about his lessons. Got caught up in that, emotionally. But students sometimes have a tough night of study and that sort of thing, and get kind of tired. That's an older picture of him, perhaps towards the end of his career. And this looks like it's of him at home, perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe in retirement years.
That's the way I knew him.
Yeah.
I saw him a few times over the years.
I think that's the last picture of him there. I got to see him a couple of times at Westminster when I was a student there. He came a couple of times to preach in the chapel service. I remember one time he came to preach, and he was up there and he was just quoting one verse of scripture after the next and going from Genesis to Revelation and back again, back and forth, and I thought, the man's lost his mind. He's just wandering all over the place and quoting scriptures. But then as I began to listen, it was all kind of coming together, and there was a theme to it, and it was quite an impressive message in the end. First, that he would remember all these scriptures and quote them so readily, and then that he'd have this theme that he put all together for you, and it was just a remarkable experience. And it was kind of different from when you read his books. There's not a lot of quotation of scripture and exposition of the scriptures. There's some, of course, but not a lot. It's more philosophical arguments, that sort of thing, reasoning. But very clearly was well versed in the scriptures and knew them very well. There's a story that Van Til was shortly after being at Westminster, about 10 years after serving at Westminster, 12 years or so, he got an invitation from Calvin College out in Michigan to come out there and to teach systematic theology out there. Now, systematic theology is a little different from apologetics. Apologetics is the defense of the Christian faith, mostly against philosophical attacks and as well from other religious belief systems. So it's very much concerned with defending the Christian faith. Systematic theology is positively presenting the faith, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of Christ, the person and work of Christ, the way of atonement, salvation, and so forth. And Van Til was contemplating and very much drawn to it because his background was in the Dutch Reformed tradition. He was born in Holland, a little town called Grootgast or something like that. But anyway, born in Holland, and it wasn't until he was 10 years of age that his family moved to the United States and moved to a town in Indiana. And he was in a farming family. Actually, we can get this here. Grootgast here, I don't know if you can see my marker here. That's where he was born in the Netherlands. And then he moved to Highland, Indiana, when he was 10 years of age. And he grew up on the farm and was in the Dutch community, the Christian Reformed Church of the time, which was a very faithful church at that time. And anyway, he was very much drawn to going back there to teach when his Scottish friend John Murray on the faculty at Westminster, who happened to be the systematic theology professor at Westminster, said to Cornelius Van Til, "Your work in apologetics is very useful and helpful to the church, but you're not equipped to be a systematic theologian." And so Murray put the kibosh on that, and Van Til appreciated his honesty and his directness and decided to stay at Westminster Seminary and continue in apologetics. So that was kind of the story there. there's a brief introduction to him in these writings that I've got here. Let me put that aside here and stop presenting that, and I'll get back to the book here. So Van Til, apologetics professor for many years at Westminster, he was really asking the question, do we build our understanding of God and the world based on a man-centered point of view, or on a point of view that's grounded in the Christian Trinity of the Scriptures? God is the fundamental presupposition, the fundamental assumption which interprets all of life for us. Or is it man and what his reasoning is able to do, or what his religious beliefs can do for him? Van Til wanted to say that we need to understand God and the world based on God's revelation of himself in Scripture. That's the foundation for all of life. So we'll see that as we go through the book here. Let me get into the start of it, and we'll read a little bit here and get a flair for Van Til's writing. I believe that there are a number of books that have been published by Van Til. A number of them are syllabuses from his teaching. There are only a handful of books that were meant to be publications. The Defense of the Faith is one. One about Karl Barth was another, and there's a third as well. What happened was, well, he had many pamphlets and articles in journals and that sort of thing, and also his syllabuses, which were published as well. I could bring some of those up for you and show them to you. We can do that another time.
I think the systematic theology book is all syllabus from.
Is published or in published form, or was a syllabus? Yeah,
I think it's in published form.
Okay, I've got it as a syllabus, I think, at least. But at any rate, actually, there's quite a large corpus of books that he's produced that's now in published form. So
I think Defense of the Faith is that's his most famous book.
Yeah.
I have a copy of that here.
Yeah, I that was the first thing I had to read in apologetics. I had to read his book, The Defense of the Faith, and it's an excellent book, very challenging book, very challenging. This booklet, Why I Believe in God, is different from most anything else he's written, with the possible exception of his other book, Paul in Athens. This book is very autobiographical, and it's written really for a general audience. It's not a technical book, so it's not getting very deep into philosophical arguments and that sort of thing. So I think it's fairly easy reading. The ideas are fairly accessible to us. I think you'll benefit from it quite a bit. You'll also see there's a very profound aspect to the way that he develops his argument, but this is very much out of his own personal experience that he talks about why I believe in God, and they'll give us a sense for the man and also his understanding of Christian faith. So this first paragraph has a variety of names that you may not be familiar with, and I can't be of much help on them myself, but we'll get started here. He writes, "You have noticed, haven't you, that in recent times certain scientists like Dr. James Jeans and Sir Arthur Eddington, as well as some outstanding philosophers like Dr. C.E.M. Joad, have had a good deal to say about religion and God. Scientists Jeans and Eddington are ready to admit that there may be something to the claims of men who say they have had an experience of God, while philosopher Joad says that the obtrusiveness of evil has virtually compelled him to look into the argument for God's existence afresh. Much like modernist theologian Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr, who talks about original sin, philosopher Joad speaks about evil as being ineradicable from the human mind. Now, we've come across a number of names here. The rest of the book is not going to be like this, so it's kind of a difficult first paragraph here, but I think much of the rest of it will be a little easier going. I'm not sure what realm of study Jeans and Eddington had. It sounds like more psychology when they talk about people having an experience of God. That's more of the field of psychology than physics or chemistry or that kind of thing. Dr. Joad is a fairly well-known philosopher. I've come across him in my studies in philosophy. I could not tell you at this point in time much about him, but a fairly significant writer. Clearly, this was written back some time ago. Let me see, when was the book written, if I have a copyright here. I don't. There's no copyright in the book. Oh well.
I was gonna guess it might have been in the 30s or 40s, but
yeah, more than likely. But anyway, so during this period of time, obviously there's a lot of questions about the existence of God. That's true of every age, I think, but perhaps it's become a little bit more interesting in Van Til's time. It's interesting about Joad noting the obtrusiveness of evil, how much evil is at work in every aspect of human life. It's inescapable, and it's kind of interesting that a philosopher would see that. Perhaps he was very much a moral philosopher and concerned about ethics and that sort of thing. And looking at the human experience, it seems that there's just this consummate evil at work within the human heart and human life. And it might be that was very much impressed on him in view of the First and Second World Wars. These kinds of things really impress you with evil in the world. And so that began to influence him to think, well, maybe there's an argument for God. And I'm not sure why he made that connection, other than the hope that this evil would be judged, and that there was a good God who provided a standard of righteousness that would oppose that kind of thing. But at any rate, there are questions about God in the philosophical realms, and then the religious area. Niebuhr would talk about original sin from the scriptures. We have that given with the book of Genesis, of course, and Paul in Romans chapter 5 addresses that very well. And as a commercial, we'll be getting into the book of Romans on Wednesday mornings. You're all encouraged to take part in that at 10 o'clock, beginning next week. But so here's the introduction, and then we'll continue. Then, too, you have on occasion asked yourself whether death ends all. You have recalled perhaps how Socrates, the great Greek philosopher, struggled with that problem the day before he drank the hemlock cup. Is there anything at all, you ask yourself, to the idea of a judgment after death? I am quite sure, you say, that there is. Am I quite sure, you say, that there is not? How do I know that there is no God? I highlighted that last question because it struck me that the form of the question is different from what we often ask. The question we usually ask is, how do I know there is a God? Van Til turns around and says, well, how do you know that there is no God? It's an interesting challenge to the scientists and others who hopefully will admit that they are finite in their understanding of the world around them, and they surely cannot say with any definiteness that there is no God. You would have to be God-like to know that there is no God, because you'd have to have infallible, comprehensive knowledge of the world to say that there is no God. So that kind of puts the unbelieving skeptic on their heels a little bit to ask, well, how do you know that there is no God? Now, Van Til's not content with that question, of course, and he'll continue on. But certainly the question of life after death intrudes itself on the human heart at different moments of life. And then, too, with life after death, is there a judgment? Speaking of the obtrusiveness of evil, the witness of our conscience is at work within us, and it tells us that we've broken God's law. We are accountable to God. At heart, it reminds us that we will be judged by what we say and do. So there's that too. So continuing, in short, as a person of intelligence, having a sense of responsibility, you have from time to time asked yourself some questions about the foundation of your thought and action. You've looked into, or at least been concerned about, what the philosophers call your theory of reality. We might call it today your worldview. So when I suggest that you spend a Sunday afternoon with me discussing my reasons for believing in God, I have the feeling that you are basically interested in what I am proposing for discussion. That statement there by Van Til, I have the feeling that you're basically interested, is kind of a coy way of expressing his view of the human heart, that we all have as what Calvin identified as a sensus deus, a sense of that God does exist and that we are accountable to him. And so the natural man, even though he may reject God and may try to live life without any reference to God, in the depths of his heart, he knows that God exists, that he's accountable to God, and while he tries to escape that knowledge in a wide variety of ways, it's there, and it's burned into him in view of the fact that he's made in the image of God. It's part of his natural makeup. So when Van Til says, I have the feeling that you're basically interested in what I'm proposing for discussion, it kind of draws on the fact that man's made in God's image, and we have this sense of God's existence about us. So he continues, to make our conversation more interesting, he's not going to give a wager here. We'll put $100 down on the bet here, but to make our conversation more interesting, let's start by comparing notes on our past. That will fit in well with our plan, for the debate concerning heredity and environment is prominent in our day. Perhaps you think that the only reason I have for believing in God is the fact that I was taught to do so in my early days. Of course, I don't think that is really so. I don't deny that I was taught to believe in God when I was a child, but I do affirm that since I have grown up, I have heard a pretty full statement of the argument against belief in God. That's probably an understatement. He's examined that very thoroughly. And it is after having heard that argument that I am more than ever ready to believe in God. Now, in fact, I feel that the whole of history and civilization would be unintelligible to me if it were not for my belief in God. So true is this that I propose to argue that unless God is back of everything, you cannot find meaning in anything. I cannot even argue for belief in him without already taking him for granted. And similarly, I contend that you cannot argue against belief in him unless you also first take him for granted. Arguing about God's existence, I hold, is like arguing about air. You may affirm that air exists, and I that it does not. But as we debate the point, we are both breathing air all the time. Or to use another illustration, God is like the emplacement on which must stand the very guns that are supposed to shoot him out of existence. However, if after hearing my story briefly you still think it is all a matter of heredity and environment, I shall not disagree too violently. My whole point will be that there is perfect harmony between my belief as a child and my belief as a man, simply because God is himself the environment by which my early life was directed, and my later life became or was made intelligible to myself. Easy for you to say. So this idea of heredity and environment is still prominent today. You'll face this kind of criticism. Oh, you were raised in a Christian church, and that's why you believe in Christ. And so they try to dismiss that, and you can always turn it around on them and say, well, you were raised as a pagan, and so you dismiss it too. We all have a background. We all have a starting point in life. The question is your starting point true? Is it an accurate description of the world around you? And Van Til is going to say that God is the foundation for all of our thinking, for everything that we say and do. Every breath we take is based on God's sovereign control of all things. Every thought that we have is subject to his sovereign will. There's nothing that we can do apart from God. Our rationality depends upon the rationality of God. Our ethics depends upon God's moral code, his righteousness, his perfection. We cannot understand these things. We cannot communicate with each other apart from presupposing God who communicates with us, the triune God in particular, Father, Son, and Spirit, who communicate with each other, who infinitely know each other through and through. This God is the foundation for all of life and for understanding all things. And we cannot argue against this God without, first of all, operating in the world which he has created and using the very things that he's given to us, breath, life, intellect, morality, and so forth, in order to kind of make that argument against God's existence. So in the end, the unbeliever is really shooting himself in the foot by trying to argue against God. So this is a great first point that Van Til makes, that God is back of everything. He is the presupposition of all of life and existence. The word presupposition and presuppositionalism is a word that Van Til himself was not too fond of. He kind of accepted it as a helpful acronym, but he viewed his apologetics not as presuppositionalism, that is, you assume something to be true and you build on that assumption everything that you then prove to be true. Presuppositionalism is often a description of his apologetics, but he views his apologetics as simply the defense of the Reformed faith. It's the Reformed faith, Christian theism, Trinitarian theism, which he is intending to defend. And so God is the environment in which we live. I'm reminded of what the Apostle Paul said in Acts 17 in Athens when he's debating with the Stoics and the Epicureans. He talked about how we have our existence in God. We are his offspring, and we have our being, our existence in God himself.
We live and move and have our being.
There you go. Thank you. I was stumbling in my recollection of that. So we'll talk here for a bit about the accident of birth, and it's only a couple pages, and we'll finish up with that today as we're getting a little bit late here. We are frequently told that much in our life depends on the accident of birth. In ancient times, some men were said to spring full grown from the foreheads of the gods. That's some forehead. That, at any rate, is not true today. Yet I understand the next best thing happened to you. You were born, I am told, in Washington, D.C., under the shadow of the White House. Well, I was born in a little thatched roof house with a cow barn attached in Holland. You wore silver slippers, and I wore wooden shoes. So we're getting into his background, his origins. He's setting up the comparison here between an American, which was his audience for this booklet, and using Washington, D.C. as kind of a helpful summary of the American experience, and then his own experience in Holland, where he wore wooden shoes. They actually did that. So he's setting things up here, and we'll continue. Is this really important for our purpose? Not particularly, but it is important that neither of us was born in Guadalcanal or Timbuktu. Both of us, were born in the midst and under the influence of Christian civilization. We shall limit our discussion then to the God of Christianity. I believe, while you do not believe, or are not sure that you do believe, in this particular kind of God. That will give point to our discussion. For surely there is no sense in talking about the existence of God without knowing what kind of God it is who may or may not exist. That's such an important statement there. In our modern day, people say, well, I believe in God. But the question is, which God do you believe in? Do you believe in the God who's the Trinity in the Christian scriptures, or do you believe in the pantheistic God that is at work in all of this world, is a part of this world, and is growing in consciousness with humanity? Do you believe in the polytheism of a wide variety of gods here and there? What kind of God do you believe in? Van Til tries to limit the discussion, not going into all the pagan ideas about a God or what have you. He's talking specifically about the Christian God. Does this God exist? And that's going to add, as he says, point and focus to the discussion. So you might bear that in mind when you hear about these surveys about people, 70% of Americans believe in God. Well, what God do they believe in? How do they define God? Is it a unipersonal God? A Unitarian God, as you find in the Jewish faith or in Islam, not the Trinity of the Christian scriptures. What is this God in which you believe? So we're focusing on specifically the God of the Christian scriptures, the Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God in three persons. So much then we have gained. We at least know in general what sort of God we are going to make the subject of our conversation. If now we can come to a similar preliminary agreement as to the standard or test by which to prove or disprove God's existence, we can proceed. You, of course, do not expect me to bring God into the room here so that you may see him. If I were able to do that, he would not be the God of Christianity. All that you expect me to do is to make it reasonable for you to believe in God. And I should like to respond quickly by saying that that is just what I am trying to do. But a moment's thought makes me hesitate. If you really do not believe in God, then you naturally do not believe that you are his creature. I, on the other hand, who do believe in God, also believe, naturally, that it is reasonable for God's creature to believe in God. So I can only undertake to show that even if it does not appear reasonable to you, it is reasonable for you to believe in God. So here we get into this idea of presuppositions, and he's arguing with somebody who does not believe in God or may not believe in God, and consequently denies the implications of that, namely that you are God's creature made in his image and you are accountable to this God. And so when you're in the system of thought that is unbelieving, skeptical, and denying the existence of God and your accountability to this God, then operating on those assumptions, it appears unreasonable for you to believe in God. And that's where you've come to in your experience. You say, well, there is no God. It doesn't make sense to that person. This is how unbelief governs the way this man looks at the world and the whole argument for God's existence. He doesn't believe in God to begin with, and so he assumes it's not reasonable for him to do so. Van Til, on the other hand, says quite the opposite, that from my system of thought, assuming God's existence and the implication that I am a creature of God is entirely natural for me to believe in God. But what Van Til does here very interestingly is he says, well, your system does not believe in God and you don't think it's reasonable to believe in God. The truth of the matter is that it is reasonable, and it's reasonable for you. In spite of your system, in spite of your point of view, it's reasonable for you to actually believe in the true God. And that's where we got to wrestle with. We got to confront you with your unbelief and your resistance to the truth of God and his revelation. So Van Til says, I see you are getting excited. You feel a little like a man who's about to undergo a major operation. not anticipating this too well. You realize that if you are to change your belief about God, you will also have to change your belief about yourself. And you're not quite ready for that. Well, you may leave if you desire. I certainly do not wish to be impolite. I only thought that as an intelligent person, you would be willing to hear the other side of the question. And after all, I am not asking you to agree with what I say. We have not really agreed on what we mean by God more than in a general and formal way. So also we need not at this point agree on the standard or test in more than a general or formal way. You might follow my argument just for argument's sake. So here he's trying to counter the innate resistance that the natural man has to belief in God and to his accountability towards this God. He does not want to listen to arguments to that end because of the consequences of that. As Van Til says, you have to change your belief about yourself. There are significant consequences to believing in God. If you believe in God, then you believe that he is the judge of all, and he will judge you. You are accountable for your sin, and you will perish. There's a lot of skin in the game here with this discussion. It's not merely a philosophical conversation over whiskey and cigars. This is a very significant, life-changing conversation to have. And Van Til recognizes this inner hostility when he says, you may leave if you desire. I mean, it's kind of what happens in the natural heart. But he appeals to the man's intelligence and to his willingness to listen at least to the other side and to hear the arguments just for the sake of the argument. And so he tries to ameliorate, tries to reduce the antagonism, the natural antagonism of the sinful heart of his opponent, enough to say, let's just consider the possibility here for a moment. Walk with me for a little while and put aside for the moment your innate hostility to the argument and just go along with me for just a little while and let's see where we go with it. And so he's trying to get the individual to at least listen to what he has to say. And that quite often is quite the challenge. We see that in our modern age with the woke culture that we're living in, and the hostility towards Christian beliefs and Christian value systems. And what happens is that you get shouted down, you get silenced, you get shadow banned and that kind of thing on social media. You get knocked out of the platform, the social media platform, because of offensive things that you might have to say. I've been reading a story about a woman named Carter who worked with Southwest Airlines, and she was upset with her airline union and its pro-choice advocacy. And so she would write to the president of the union about her pro-life views, and she even shared pictures of aborted fetuses, aborted children. And the president of the union referred her to her company for offensive speech, and the company fired her because she was a representative of Southwest Airlines, in that she on Facebook had pictures of herself in her uniform. She was a stewardess on the planes, and anything that she would say could be construed as speaking on behalf of the company. Now that's a ridiculous assertion, to say that just because she works for the company, everything she says represents the company. But anyway, she was fired, and she took it to court. She sued the company, and she won, at least to a certain measure, a judgment against Southwest Airlines, and that's still being worked through, going through the system with appeals and that sort of thing. But you see the hostility of our woke culture, our unbelieving culture, towards Christian faith in the various ways in which it expresses itself. If you can't answer the argument, you shut the person down, you shut them up, you silence them. And Van Til is trying to say, listen, just bear with me for a moment. Put aside your hostility and just listen for a moment to what I have to say. And at the end of that, that's certainly a reasonable thing to ask. At the end of that, then make your judgment. Don't make a judgment even before you've even heard the case. And so that's our argument as well for continuing in this little booklet here. Let's continue with him in the weeks to come, and see what he has to say about his own life experience. He's going to talk about his childhood, his schooling. It's going to be very much a biographical commentary, but then he'll get into some objections toward the latter half of the book and work through them with us. And it's going to be a very, very interesting study. I hope you'll hang in there with it. So I'll finish there, and if you have questions or comments, feel free to.
I love what he had to say on page 3, at least that's where it is in the booklet I have. Arguing about God's existence, I hold, is like arguing about air. You may affirm that air exists and deny that it does not, but as we debate the point, we are both breathing air all the time. That's exactly what's going on when you talk to people about God.
Yeah.
You know, they live and move and have their being because of him, and yet they're denying him and they don't want to hear anything about him, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, here it is here.
Yeah.
I guess we could say to them, well, if you don't believe about God, then stop breathing.
Yeah, right.
Because the air you have is his air.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, I'm so thankful. This is incredible because he was indirectly had a influence on my conversion, because this argument was used by a supermarket friend of mine back in the day when I worked in the supermarket with some Westminster students. And the Westminster student had me over. This is when I was unbeliever. And he was showing me this graph, this rectangle with the diagonal lines.
Oh, really?
That was developed by Van Til about presuppositions, and showing me how, as an unbeliever, I believe certain things and that God said other things. And we sat haven't talked about, and I was the guinea pig that he's talking about. The unbeliever, and
Wow.
so this is incredible. This
Yeah.
is incredible. It's exactly the way I was thinking at the time, and the arguments. So I appreciate the faithfulness of the influence of Van Til on the student and his faithfulness in sharing it with me.
Yeah.
So it was really good, and boy, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the air out too. I seem to remember that too. It's a very, very clear argument. Very, very clear argument. Yeah.
I'm sad that I lived or went to seminary when Van Til was teaching at Westminster in the early 70s when I was at Biblical. And Dr. McCrae, who was the president of Biblical and my Old Testament history and Old Testament professor, was a personal friend of Van Til. They had disagreements, sadly, earlier in the years, and Dr. McCrae was a premillennialist when Van Til was an amillennialist, I guess. So they disagreed over that, and they disagreed over smoking and drinking and Christian liberty, we call it today. And actually, it became so serious for Dr. McCrae that he left Westminster Seminary and started Faith Seminary in Elkins Park, or went there at least. But I guess 3 or 4 times, more than that. Van Til was a member of Presbyterian, so when I was licensed, he was one of the men there at Presbyterian. So as I came under care and so forth, I remember him, and I remember Dr. Woolley. Those 2 professors were still involved in Presbyterian meetings, and I'm part of Philadelphia Presbyterian, along with Dr. Kushke. But I never talked personally to Van Til all that time. He did come I think it was my senior year. Dr. McCrae had his 70th birthday, and they invited Van Til to come to our birthday celebration. It was held at Christopher Dock and in the auditorium there. And Van Til did come and all, and spoke about how McCrae's name was Allen, Allan. Well, Van Til used to call him Allie, and McCrae and others referred to Cornelius as Corny. So they had these sort of personal names for one another, even though we're professionally, involved at teaching at Westminster.
Yeah.
But anyway, Dr. Van Til used that. He got up there and said, "I'm here to speak at Allie's birthday." And they had not seen each other in a number of years. The talk around the student body was, this is a real breakthrough that Van Til's going to come and speak for Dr. McCrae's birthday, because who knows the last time they saw one another. Although I have a feeling that they probably communicated through the years more than we knew.
Mm-hmm.
I was
also I'm sorry.
I was acquainted with Van Til through my Bible Fellowship Church experience, just a little bit. I got to read a little bit of him in high school. Incidentally, Van Til was responsible for starting the high school that I attended, Philmont Christian Academy. He was the founding influence of that school. He was the part of the original faculty for Westminster Seminary, which was a remarkable faculty as it began. And he was also very influential in the beginnings of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So a very influential man on many different levels. But when I went off to college, I began, particularly at Covenant College, I got a chance to meet with Gordon Clark, who is also a Christian philosopher, reformed in his thinking, but had some differences with Van Til, and he critiqued Van Til in different places, and there was a history between Gordon Clark and particularly the followers of Van Til. Van Til himself did not engage Clark too much, but I was strongly influenced by Clark, but I've come around to Van Til's way of thinking about things and come to understand what he had to say and appreciate that. So, and we come through different avenues, I guess, to appreciate Van Til. I think he's terrific, at this point in my life. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say that because I was really taught at biblical and at Faith Seminary before I went to biblical that Van Til was wrong, and we were not a presuppositional seminary. We were, I would call it evidentialist. It's about what we were, probably followers more of Clark than we would have been of Dr. Van Til. In fact, I didn't read a book about that was written by Van Til, anything written by Van Til in apologetics class. I only read Jerusalem and Athens, which was a Festschrift. Well, maybe not a Festschrift. Was it a Festschrift?
yeah, I believe.
But anyway, it was a critique. There were critiques of Van Til in that book, and that's what my professor wanted us to read and understand. So I really was, I won't say anti-Van Til, but I was certainly ignorant of Van Til in many ways when I came out of seminary.
One thing I wanted to mention was I was impressed with the first paragraph when he talked about how the preponderance of evil gives us an insight into God.
Yeah.
So in other words, that was amazing. It's just because we see all this evil around us, that reminds us that, well, there has to be an alternative to this.
Right.
Why do we think that way? It's because how do we know what good is?
Exactly.
And that was a good start to the book.
Yeah, this will be, can I say, a fun read? But I urge you, if you read Defense of the Faith or something else, he is very profound, not easy to read. So I hate to say that about him, because he's very clear in this book, but he's not as clear in other writings. He seems to go over my head. I don't. Rich might feel differently.
Oh, he's a challenge, and to read, he's a challenge, and sometimes people don't like him because he uses concepts and ideas that people are not familiar with, and these are syllabuses of his from seminary, and I got a bunch of them here. Christian Theistic Ethics, Introduction to Systematic Theology, booklet on apologetics, The Great Debate Today, Who Do You Say That I Am? A bunch of things, and more too. There are better copies of the book too. These are just...
And Greg Monson, who was a student of Van Til, probably back in the 70s, because he is about my age, has written a big book on Van Til's apologetics. And I got a copy. I read about 100 pages, maybe a little more, and I had to put it down because even reading Greg, who was easier to read than Van Til himself, but when he quoted from Van Til and so forth, I just couldn't follow it always. Even though it was there were some good things. I remember underlining quite a bit in that book,
Yeah.
and appreciating it, but I got bogged down in it.
I'd like to say that his approach is very interesting. That there's a way to do it, you know. Like when I was studying Japanese martial arts, to subdue somebody's force, you know, there's a technique that works, you know, and if you do it another way, it doesn't work at all. And I think that the part we were reading where he was explaining the ways to put it towards someone, it is self-reflective for me, because I'm very timid all the time, and I don't want to push someone the wrong way or push their buttons or anything. And I think how he puts it makes me look at the person I am, and forces me to recognize that I might have some unbeliefs or something, and to reorganize that in myself and to set things straight in myself is to do that in others.
It seems to me this is a very natural way to defend your faith in God and in Christ. He's not going to take you through the ontological argument, the teleological arguments, and all these philosophical things and get you completely confused. It's just a very natural exposition of why he believes in God. This is who he is. So I think for all the depth, I mean, you get into this here, and you're going to get into some, a lot of argumentation here from different perspectives.
Yeah, because he'll mention other philosophers like Dewey and like Joad and others that he's mentioned in this book. So, and what they believe and their worldview and what presuppositions they have and everything. Yeah. And I'm not a philosopher type. I don't have a philosophy type mind. This why I like this book, because it's practical. I have a more practical mind, I think, than the philosophers usually have. They're up in the sky. I'm down on the ground, so to speak, and all. So, I've always had people say to me, "Oh, you made that so plain." And I think, well, I needed to make it plain because I wouldn't have been able to say anything if I didn't have some practical way of explaining something.
Yeah. You're Aristotle, not Plato. Anyway, here's a biography of Van Til.
Oh, that's an excellent biography.
By John Muther, who was a librarian, I think, and a very, very fine book.
Yeah, he's, I believe is he at Sproul's College? I can't remember.
I don't remember reading that about him. Muther is librarian and associate professor of church history at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando.
Oh, yeah, okay, so he's part of RTS, I guess,
He
the Orlando campus.
He served on the Harvard Divinity School library staff, has been a librarian at Western Theological Seminary and Westminster Theological Seminary. John Muther.
Yeah, I think he's maybe part of the committee on the historian, maybe, for or has been in our denomination.
Yeah, it could be. I don't remember, but he's an OPC guy, I believe.
Yeah, well, his family, I know John's brother, Chuck, and I know his sister Mary. They came to camp.
I'm going to take off, guys. Talk to you later.
Okay, God bless.
Okay.
All right,
Bye-bye, you too. See you all.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember Mary Meether or Chuck Meether at camp years ago.
No.
But Mary was a counselor for us. Chuck was a camper,
Okay.
and Chuck's now a minister, and an OP minister.
All right. Well, Lord willing, we'll pick this up again next time.
Yeah.
And make some more progress. So, and there's another.
I read ahead in the book a little more last night, and there's going to be some very interesting things that come out in the next few pages from his life experience, which I think we'll all relate to.
Okay. See you all next week, God willing.
Okay. Take
Bye
care.
now.
God bless.
Oh, okay.